Come on in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Put this on the shelf under there.
באמת? Yeah? איש נחמד ומאוד חכם. מאוד נחמד. גם כן תינוק. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Come have a seat. We're delighted you're here. I'm surprised, I have to tell you. I looked outside and there's this river running down the street, and it's just remarkable that you're here. So thank you for braving the rain and the elements. I'm so glad that you could be with us. For those who are visiting, we welcome you. For those who have been with us for some time, thank you for coming. It's wonderful to have you. This is Valley Beth Shalom, and on Wednesday nights we learn together. We call this the Valley Beth Shalom College of Jewish Studies. We offer you the chance to do university-level learning without quizzes, football teams, or sororities every Wednesday night. And this year, our course of study is devoted to personal theology, to the God we know and the God we believe in and the God who has a part in our lives. And we've had the wonderful opportunity to ask numbers of scholars, rabbis and teachers from all over the community to help us understand the God that they believe in and that they worship and they believe in. And in a moment, I'll introduce our distinguished guest. Just a couple of quick announcements for everyone. Friday night is Shabbat. This Shabbos is Shabbos Shira, the Sabbath of song and celebration. And in celebration of that Friday night for Kabbalat Shabbat at about 7 o'clock, we'll be welcoming Navat Tehillah, which is a wonderful musical group from Yerushalayim. If you've been to Jerusalem, and on Friday in the summertime, on Friday afternoon, they do this Kabbalat Shabbat in the train station, in the Tachana Rishona, and Navat Tehillah is the musical group that does it. And they get thousands of people who come, so they're on tour, and they'll be visiting us this weekend and learning and praying with us. So please come back and enjoy some music and some celebration. Shabbos morning, of course, Torah study at 9 o'clock, followed with davening and followed by whatever is for lunch. And then this coming week, we'll continue with our College of Jewish Studies. Our College of Jewish... How's that better? It's a small group, so I'm trying to be intimate here. We'll continue next Wednesday night as well. It's a custom to do this as a community, so if you'll all stand up, turn to the folks beside you and wish them good evening and welcome, and congratulations for making it through the rain. Good. And now, before you sit down, don't sit down so quickly, but if you don't mind, put your arms about the people beside you, draw them close. We should actually bench Gomel instead of the usual one, but let's say our usual bracha for the opportunity to learn Torah together with great teachers and scholars. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Before you sit down, we had news this afternoon that there are groups of people all over the valley who couldn't make it tonight because of the rain, that they either can't or are not allowed to drive in the rain. They're having viewing parties because this lecture is going to be on live stream online. So everybody turn around and wave at the camera and say, welcome. Welcome, welcome. We're glad you're here. Hi, Pop. My dad's at home watching this because he can't drive in the rain. Come sit down, please. I think all of us have had occasion one time or another, all of us have had occasion to find ourselves in one of the many Chabad centers that fill the community. If you've been there for Shabbos, if you've been there for a holiday, if you've been there because you needed some guidance and some love. And I think all of us, when we approach Chabad, I'm terribly impressed with the passion, the enthusiasm, the love of Torah, the love of the Jewish people, and the selflessness of the people of the Chabad community. So I thought it was important that in our conversation about different forms of Jewish belief and theology, we invite Chabad to come in to teach us. Now, there are a lot of Chabad rabbis, thank God, in the area, and I didn't know which one. So I asked friends, who should I ask? You know, and everyone said, you got to ask this guy in Northridge. So I called Rabbi Rivkin, he's very kind, and I introduced myself. I'm Ed Feinstein, I work at Valley Beth Shalom in Encino. He said, I've heard of it. I said, we'd like to have you come and teach for a night in this series on personal beliefs in God. And I never met Rabbi Rivkin before, he was recommended so wonderfully, and he asked the very best question. This is how you got invited to this gig. Because he said to me, this was such an insightful question. He said, I don't want this to be a contest. No, very seriously. I don't want this to be a contest between one belief and another belief. The Jewish people doesn't need that. Now, first of all, I assured him, of course it's not a contest. We want to learn. We want to learn from you. But at the same time, I said, boy, that's the right question to ask. That's exactly what I would want someone to say. The Jewish people needs us to learn together, to grow together, to rise together. We don't need to be rivals with each other. That's the very best attitude. Rav Rivkin is the rabbi of Chabad of Northridge. It's a few miles and 10 million gallons of water between here and there. You can stay the night if you want to, really. We'd love to have you. Rav Rivkin is a third-generation shaliach of Chabad. That is, his parents and grandparents are already given to the work of bringing Torah to the world. He was educated in Crown Heights in New York and serves with great distinction in our community. We're proud to have you here. We're delighted to have you here. Please welcome Rabbi Eli Rivkin. Now, in order to do this, you have to speak right into the mic or they'll scream at you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I just want to say to the camera that I agree. That my wife makes the best challah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's really a tremendous pleasure and honor to be here, and a yasher koach to Rabbi Feinstein and to his incredible staff for all of their hard work and their vision in bringing so many people together here and online to study Torah, to learn from each other, and to gain in our unity through the knowledge of our traditions. And that's really how we are united. We're united through the things that we learn and when we learn about where we come from. And a big yasher koach to Rabbi Feinstein for putting this together. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I'd like to begin with a story. The story takes place in 2007. There's a beautiful Chabad tradition that one of the ways that the Chabad rabbis are trained is as they are students, they go out on what's called Merkez Shlichus. Merkez Shlichus means that you specifically look for remote, rural communities, not just here in the States, but all over the world. And literally, you arrive in a town and you look for Jewish people. Try to find Jews who are not necessarily connected to a community, haven't had the opportunity to be involved. I had the privilege to do Merkez Shlichus in a wide variety of locations, and it's a very interesting experience. So you have these two rabbis in northern Florida who are doing Merkez Shlichus. They're traveling around trying to find lost Jews. Now, most people think of Florida, they think that's a pretty Jewish place. But that's southern Florida. Northern Florida is a little bit different. And so they're traveling around, they're trying to find people, and it was one of these neighborhoods where people were looking at them funny, and what are you doing here, and what's with the hat, and so on. And they pull into a gas station, and in addition to getting gas, they're trying to find a Jew. And they go over to the attendant, and they say, are there any Jews here, or any Jews that you know? We're looking for Jewish people. And the attendant looks at them and says, Jews you're looking for? come with me to the back. So they get a little nervous. Well, two guys. They walk to the back, and he takes them into the office of the gas station. And lying on a couch in the office is an old man. And the attendant says to the old man, he says, "Grandpa, they're here for you." Again, here for us, here for you. They're not sure what they're talking about. The old man says, "Sit down, let me tell you a story." He says, "I know why you're here." He says, "I was born in Poland in the 1930s. Grew up in Poland, went to a cheder, spoke Yiddish, grew up in that beautiful, rich, warm environment of the shtetl in Europe. And then the Nazis came, and everything was taken. Everything fell apart. Right before my bar mitzvah is when everything was ripped away." He says, "I lost my entire family, ended up in the concentration camps. And while I was there, I made a promise that if I survive, I will journey as far from Judaism as possible. And if I have a family, I will never put this curse upon my family." This is what he said. He says, "I survived. I came to America, came to New York, and I said to them, 'How do I get away from Judaism?' And they said, 'Go south.'" So he ends up in northern Florida, gets married, has children, eventually grandchildren. Not a word about Judaism. Doesn't breathe a word about his identity. 1985, he says, "I was laying on the couch and I was flipping through the channels on cable television, satellite television, whatever it was in those days. And suddenly on the screen, I see a rabbi. I see a rabbi speaking in Yiddish. There was an English translation, but I didn't need the translation. I understood the Yiddish, and it captured my attention, and instead of moving on, I decided to listen. Now, just to give you a little background, what he was looking at, in the 1980s, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who would have these large gatherings called Fabrengens, these Fabrengens were broadcast on satellite television, on cable television, and you could pick it up. And they had an English translation. And this is what he happened upon. And he says, the Rebbe is talking, and he's talking about the difference between the exodus from Egypt and the exodus from this exile with Mashiach. We know the Midrash tells us that when the Jews were in Egypt, 4/5 of the Jewish people remained behind in Egypt. That's what it says. The Chamushim, only 1/5 of the Jewish people left Egypt. This week's Torah portion. Said the Rebbe in this Fabrengen, the contrast is that when Mashiach comes, no Jew is going to be left behind. Doesn't matter if a Jew is involved, is not involved, is knowledgeable, is not knowledgeable. And then the man says, the rabbi looked at the screen, and I felt him looking at me, and he said to me that the prophet says that Mashiach is going to go, va'atem teluktu le'echad echad. He will go one by one and find one Jew at a time and bring them closer to Judaism. And then he says, and even if there's a Jew who for reasons beyond his control ran away from Judaism, even that person will be found and brought back to Judaism. He says, when I heard those words, I knew he was speaking to me. And that night I told my grandchildren, one day they're going to show up and they're going to take me back to Judaism. So when you came today, we know why you're here. The rabbis say, the bad news is we're not Mashiach. But we can try to bring you a little bit closer to Judaism. And they put on tefillin with him, and they helped him have a bar mitzvah of sorts. And they left him a phone number, and they said, we'll be back in a few weeks, we'll visit you again. And this was his connection. A week later, they got a phone call from the grandson. Our grandfather passed away. And he gave us your phone number. And he requested that you give him a Jewish burial. And so the question that I'd like to address is, Why were there two young men giving up their summer vacation to travel in northern Florida to find lost Jews? Why? They had nothing better to do. Why was a rabbi in Brooklyn who grew up in Russia, in Ukraine, worried about finding lost Jews? There were plenty of Jews in Brooklyn, plenty of Jews in Ukraine. Do we do questions now or later? Later. Okay, so we'll get to the questions later. And I think the answer to that question is in part Hasidus, Hasidic teachings. Hasidus, and that's what I'd like to spend a few minutes speaking about. What is it that drives a person? What is it that inspires a person who studies the teachings of Hasidus and who tries to live the ways of Hasidus? Hasidus is a philosophy, it's a lifestyle, and what does it do to a person? How does it give them staying power in all challenges and all difficulties? Just a little bit of background information. The founder of the Hasidic movement is the famous Baal Shem Tov. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. Lived about 300 years ago. I'm going to quote him a little bit this evening. The founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement is the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Schneur Zalman. He wrote a famous book called the Tanya, which you may have heard of. We'll quote that a little bit this evening as well. I think it's important to point out that Hasidus did not teach necessarily new ideas to Judaism, but rather re-energized, reinvigorated existing ideas that had perhaps fallen to the wayside over the years of difficulty and challenges in the various persecutions which the Jewish people experienced. Interestingly enough, when the Hasidic movement first started, as you know, this is not a history course, but I'm sure you're aware of this, there was tremendous opposition, and it suffered tremendously in its early years. Amazingly, today, I think it's fair to say that all segments of the Jewish community, all denominations, study in some way the teachings of Hasidus, the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and his students and the generations of Rebbes. I understand that your esteemed rabbi has studied Hasidus. I actually listened to a lecture of yours and you quoted the Gerer Rebbe, so I have proof. And I think it's an incredible thing. And I think this would make the Baal Shem Tov very proud, because against all odds, the fact that these teachings were able to come to life is truly an incredible thing. So what does Hasidus do? What does the study of these teachings, what does it do for a person? What can it possibly do to help us strengthen Jewish continuity, which is obviously the challenge that many rabbis and many lay leaders worry about, inspiring the next generation. So I'd like to turn your attention for a moment. You have text number 2 in your handouts. This is actually from this week's Torah portion. The Jewish people witnessed the splitting of the sea, like we did as we were coming across Densmore. Okay? And they sang a song. They sang a song of thanks, the famous song Az Yashir, which we say every day in our prayers. And one of the verses in Az Yashir, interestingly enough, this verse is actually connected to Wednesday because it's the 4th Aliyah of Parshat Bishalach, which is connected to the 4th day of the week, to Wednesday. We say, Ze keli va'anvehu, elikei avi va'arei memenu. This is my God, and I will praise him, the God of my fathers, and I will exalt him. So the famous Shalah, Rabbi Yeshaya Halevi Horowitz, says an interesting thing. And let me say it outside. You can look at the text yourself inside, but here's what he says. It's fascinating. He says, if you read the words ve'anvehu, and I will praise him, you can break it up into 2 parts. You can say, va'ani vehu. It's me and him. I am there together with him. I am close to him. Him in this case being God. Elokei avi, if it is the God of my father, va'arom amenhu, he is exalted. Says Rabbi Horowitz, if a Jew looks at Judaism, if a Jew looks at Torah as their own Judaism, as being theirs, this is mine, this belongs to me, then it's something that I feel close with. It's something that I'm passionate about. Va'ani vehu, we will be together in this for a long time, we say to God. But if it's just Elokei avi, it's something that was somehow connected to my ancestors, and I'm interested in it because it's my heritage, but I examine it perhaps skeptically, and I'm not so sure, and it's something that I look at, but I don't necessarily feel and connect with, then va'arom menhu, it's going to be beyond me. It's going to be above me. right? Human beings, we have the ability to connect with something in a very deep and meaningful and passionate way when it's ours. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that this Sunday there's a bit of a football game taking place. It's actually happening in my hometown in New Orleans. My condolences to the Rams fans. You guys are playing the Saints, but it's okay. So what's interesting is, both in New Orleans and in Los Angeles, there are millions of people who are super excited and passionate about a football team. They're very excited. And their hearts will go up and down as the game is played. If you've watched a football game, if you yourself are a football fan, you know what I'm talking about. If not, you probably have a crazy neighbor who does that. Now, I ask you a question. Of these millions of people, how many of them really understand the game? How many of them know the players and know the statistics and understand exactly how the game works? Some of them do. Many of them don't. And yet, a Los Angeles resident, when the Rams score a touchdown, they go crazy. Not as crazy as a New Orleans resident when the Saints score a touchdown, but that's the way New Orleans is. Why? Why? Because it's my home. It's mine. This is my team. It's not Elokei Avi. It's not something which is distant from me. It's not someone else's team. This is mine, and if it's mine, I'm extremely passionate about it. You know, it's very interesting. We have a very important service that we do a couple times a year in the synagogue. Yizkor. What does the word Yizkor mean? Remember. Remember. It's interesting. In Hebrew, we don't have a word, as far as I know. Mrs. Goldman will correct me. We don't have a word for history in Hebrew. How do we say history in Hebrew? Historia. That's like construction, right? It's an English word. How do we say history in Hebrew? There is no word. Why? Because there's a very big difference between history and remember. History is his story, someone else's story. It's not mine. I had old-fashioned grandparents. They had a story. There's a story about Abraham and a story about the crossing of the Red Sea. It's his story. Remember is just the opposite. There's dismember, to take something apart, and there's remember, to put things together. Remember is when that story becomes my story. And that is what gives Judaism staying power. When we're passionate, when we feel it as our own, when it becomes part of our psyche, part of who we are in our hearts, then we have something very, very powerful. You know, they tell a cute story. There was once a rabbi, one of his favorite subjects to lecture upon was that you have to be very gentle when you talk to children. Always speak to children gently, no matter what the children do. I have a feeling the rabbi didn't have children because it's not quite realistic. But this is what the rabbi used to say. Anyway, one day the rabbi pulls up to the synagogue, and they had just put down new cement in the yard. And there was a group of kids who showed up for Hebrew school, and they decided to have fun. They're running through the wet cement. And the rabbi goes crazy. He starts screaming at them. Do you know how much this cost us? You're making such a mess. It's going to dry with permanent footprints. Someone came over to the rabbi and said, Rabbi, aren't you the one who always talks about speaking to children gently? And he says, yes, that's in the abstract. This is in the concrete. Judaism in the abstract doesn't have staying power. But when it's real, when it's yours, when it belongs to you, it's very powerful. The question is, in 2019, how do we do that? How do we take ideas that come from long ago, don't necessarily relate to our day-to-day lives of 2019 with our technology and our cars and all the different things that we have to deal with? How does this work? And the answer is actually found in 3 words. And this is much of what Hasidus talks about. Chochmah, Bina, Dat. Oh, very good. It actually stands for the word Chabad. Chabad does not mean outreach organization. Chabad does not mean community center. Chabad means use your mind to impact your instincts and your desires to feel in a certain way, to be passionate about Judaism. That's what Chabad means. Let's look for a second at this word dat. What does dat mean? Let's look at text number 1 from the book of Tanya. We know that chokhmah means wisdom, bina means understanding, and dat is typically translated as knowledge. Okay? In the book of Tanya, and I just have a very, very brief quote over here, he says that actually dat plays a very important role. Not just connected with the intellect, with the mind, but how to create that bridge between the mind and the emotions, the mind and the heart. Let's look for a moment. Text number 1, dat, whose etymology may be found in the verse, and Adam knew Eve. And by the way, the next thing is they have children. Okay, so he wasn't just knowing Eve. It implies intimate attachment and union. The Torah uses the term dat to identify intimacy, because intimacy is not just a physical act, but it's a union, it's a knowledge on the deepest level. What is dat for a human being? Dat for a human being is using the tremendous power of the mind, the tremendous power of the intellect, the power of your values, of the things you learn about, of the things you gain knowledge of the things you know to be right, and to make them yours, to create an intimate emotional connection with those ideas. It's interesting, Maimonides also talks about this when he talks about the mitzvah to develop a love for Judaism. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you should love Hashem, your God. You should love your Judaism. And he asks the question, how on earth are you supposed to command someone to love something? Right? You can command someone to do something. How do you command someone to love something? I can tell my children, eat the broccoli. I can't tell them, love the broccoli. How do you do that? Says Maimonides, and it's quoted over here in text number 3. We're not going to read the entire thing. You can look at it yourself. He says, use the power of the mind and connect it on a personal level, and that will develop a passion and an emotion that drives you to do what it is Judaism expects you to do. You know, they tell a very, very interesting story, which I think illustrates the power of the mind in a very visceral fashion. I read the story in the book Chicken Soup for the Soul, the original one, not the branches that came afterwards. They tell a story like this. It's an early morning in Manhattan, in New York, on a subway train. As you know, people in New York are real. So in the morning, they're really in a bad mood. That's the way it is. And everyone is sitting on the train, this one with their newspaper, this one with their iPad, and they're drinking their coffee. And the doors open up, and in walks a father and 3 sons, 3 boys. The father sits down, puts his head in his hands, and the boys begin to wreak havoc across the train, running around, jumping, crawling, under, over, swinging from the handlebars. And people are looking at the father. Do something about your children. And he is oblivious. He's in a different world. After a few minutes, the energy in the train is just getting angrier and angrier and more frustrated. And finally, one of the kids swings across and knocks over a coffee. And the owner of the coffee jumps up, goes over to the father and says, "Why don't you control your boys?" And he says, "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize what they were doing." He says, why aren't you aware of what your children are doing? He says, "I'm really sorry. We just left the hospital. Their mother just died." And what happens is, suddenly, all of that anger, which was real, turns into compassion. Everybody just wants to give this father a hug, give these boys a hug. What happened? It illustrates the power of the mind to influence the emotions, to influence how we feel. On a very basic level, what this means is we have the ability, and this is what Hasidus teaches us to do and trains us to do, we have the ability to prepare ourselves mentally before we have an emotional interaction, to be in the right frame of mind and to cultivate the right emotions. We have the ability with the power of our mind, moach shalit al halev, the intellect has the ability to discipline the heart, we have the ability to, with willpower, to choose to do the right thing. But on a deeper level, what we're being encouraged to do is to slowly but surely, over many years of discipline and practice, much of which is built into our religious practice, to train yourself, to alter your instincts, to alter your desires, to desire things that are uplifting, that are transcendent, that are selfless, and to want to stay away from the opposite. Obviously, that's not the nature of a human being. And I think every person struggles. We have our values, the things that we know to be right, and then we have our human nature. I think it was Socrates, I may be wrong, but I think it was Socrates, the great philosopher, who was once caught by his students engaged in a very immoral act. And if it wasn't him, I ask forgiveness. And his students came over to him and said, this is what you do? And he says, listen, just because I'm Socrates doesn't mean I'm not human. I'm a human being. There's Socrates in the classroom and there's Socrates at home. That's it. And that's, in a sense, not to that extreme, but that's in a sense what many human beings struggle with. And very often we settle for less than our values because of human nature. And what Hasidus teaches us is that through avodah, through working on ourselves, whether it's through meditation, through study, through actual religious practice, the performance of mitzvot, going through the motions, it actually has the ability to slowly but surely cultivate within the individual a new, more refined human nature. And that's a very, very powerful accomplishment. In fact, this is the entire purpose of prayer and reciting blessings. It's not that God needs us to talk to him every day and ask him for things and he's just waiting to hear from us. Prayer blessings are a script for contemplation, for meditation, for reminding ourselves who we are and what our purpose is here in this world. And so this is what Hasidus tries to do. It gives a person the tools to develop a passion for our traditions through a system, a discipline of study, of prayer, of contemplation that slowly but surely refines the human being. There's a beautiful story told regarding the founder of the Hasidic movement, the Baal Shem Tov. As you may know, in the early days of the Hasidic movement, there was tremendous opposition to this movement. And one of the things that people were opposed to was that they were too happy. Now, I know that may sound a little strange, but in those days, it was considered sacrilegious to rejoice unnecessarily. Simchas Torah, Purim, you dance a little bit, you celebrate, but otherwise, we're very serious, solemn people. That's the way Jewish scholars were. The Baal Shem Tov came along and he began to teach the ways of Hasidus, and he inspired people, especially the simple people, and he brought tremendous joy to their lives. And one time, he came to a town, and as was his custom, he would gather all the simple folk in the middle of the town square, and he begins to tell them words of encouragement, words of inspiration, and they feel this tremendous joy, and they begin to sing a Hasidic melody, and they begin to clap, and soon they're all dancing in a circle in the middle of the street. One of the opponents of the Hasidic movement comes over to the Baal Shem Tov and says, "What is this? On a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of the market, you're dancing? This is inappropriate. This is sacrilegious." He says, "Let me explain to you what's going on over here." He says, one time, there was a person who was deaf, couldn't hear. And he was in a marketplace, and to that marketplace came a very talented musician who played the fiddle in the most incredible fashion. Now, you know the fiddle is a very joyous instrument. And he begins to play the fiddle, and people start to clap along, and people start to dance. People are dancing and singing to the sound of this beautiful music. And the man who's deaf goes over to his friend and says, "Why on earth are these people dancing?" And he says, "My dear friend, if you could hear the music that they hear, you would be dancing as well." Said the Baal Shem Tov to this man, "If you could hear the music of life that these people are listening to, you would be dancing as well." The purpose of the teachings of Hasidus is to allow a human being to listen to that music and to dig a little bit deeper and to see things from a deeper perspective. So what I'd like to do, and I have no idea how much time I have because, okay, as much as I want. All right, we'll be here till tomorrow morning when it stops raining. Okay. What I'd like to do, if you're still with me, is to take a few minutes and focus on what are some of these values, what are some of these ideas which Hasidus teaches us, and how can they perhaps impact us in our daily lives, with our human realities, with our challenges that we deal with on a regular basis. And we'll split it up into two parts, and we'll try to do this as quickly as possible, because I know you have coffee waiting for you. Number one, we're going to focus on how does Hasidus see the world? How do we see the environment, the playing field in which we operate? And then number two, how does Hasidus encourage us to see the players? How does Hasidus encourage us to see ourselves and those that we associate with? Let's begin with how we see the world. Let's study a text. This is a bit of a long text, but it's worth studying. This text, text number 4, is from the book of the Tanya, the second section of the book of Tanya, where Rabbi Schneur Zalman, the author, really sets out in 12 chapters the proper interpretation and meditation that one is supposed to have when they recite the Shema, which of course we do at least twice a day. So studying this is pretty important because it's relevant to you twice a day. Here's what he says, and I'm going to say it outside and then we can read some of it inside. He says a very interesting point. He quotes from Psalms where it says that God's words stand forever. Let's look inside. The first paragraph. It is written in Psalms, page 2, text number 4. Forever Hashem, your word stands firm in the heavens. This is from King David. The Baal Shem Tov explained that your word, which you uttered, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, these very words and letters stand firmly forever within the heavens and are forever clothed within all the heavens to give them life. What is he saying? What he's saying is, when it says your words stand in the heavens, we know that according to the account of creation in Genesis, God creates the world through divine speech, through the letters of the holy tongue. It's interesting, in the very first verse of the Torah, what does it say? Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. It could have said, Bereshit bara Elohim shamayim va'aretz. The 8 seems to be not necessary. 8 is 2 letters, Aleph and Taf. All the letters, meaning like this. If you want to build a building, before you can build, you need material and tools. First, God created letters. Bereshit bara Elohim et. First, he creates letters. First, he creates the holy language. And then he creates shamayim va'aretz. That is what energizes the heavens and the earth. But according to this verse in Psalms, it's not that there was a one-time energy that flows forth and brings creation into existence, but rather it's a constant process. And the Baal Shem Tov continues further. Second paragraph, for if the letters were to depart even for an instant, God forbid, and return to their source, all the heavens would become naught and absolute nothingness, and it would be as though they never existed at all, exactly as before the utterance, let there be firmament. And so the utterances are a constant flow of energy into reality in order to keep reality in existence. Let's skip to the third paragraph. An interesting thought from the Arizal, one of the earlier Kabbalists. I understand you had a fascinating lecture last week on Kabbalah, so you've heard of the Arizal. This same thought was expressed by the Arizal when he said that even in completely inanimate matter, such as stones or water or earth, there is a soul and spiritual life force. By the way, think about it for a second. When he said this in the 16th century, 15th, 16th century, you would imagine people might have made fun of him. What are you, crazy? A stone? A stone has life. A stone is an inanimate object that sits. And he said, no, it has a soul. It has energy. We now know that if you look at a stone from the atomic level, there's a lot of energy. There's a lot of movement. There are things that are taking place. And if you believe that energy comes from God, there has to be a soul within the stone. And so essentially, what are we saying over here? And I'll let you read the rest of the text on your own. Essentially, what we're saying is that we have a very involved creator. We, as Jews, believe that we have a God who didn't just create, but who remains involved in a very intimate fashion, which, by the way, is different, as far as I understand, from other philosophies. If you look at text number 5, the Aristotelian concept of God is that God is perfect, and therefore God cannot relate to the imperfect. God is beyond this world. I'm not reading the text. You can read it on your own. It's just a quote from Wikipedia. But the idea is that, according to Aristotle, God is too great, too infinite, too lofty to be intimately involved in what's happening in this world. I heard, I'm far from an expert in Christian theology, but I heard that it's partially for this reason the Christians were very uncomfortable with this notion, because if God is too lofty to care about what's happening in this world, then you lose all morality. You end up with the law of the jungle, which was very much the case with the empires in those days. And so the Christians said, we need to have some sort of a God that can actually relate to this world. And so that evolved into an intermediary. And so you'll have a person who's a part God, and through that person you can relate to the loftier God. Judaism rejected that. And Judaism rejected that because Judaism has a very interesting notion of God's loftiness. God is so lofty that he or she or it relates to this world. Because God is so great, therefore God cares about this world. Let's look at an interesting quote here from the Zohar, text number 6, regarding the Ein Sof. A very brief text. The infinite light is above beyond all limitation and below beyond all measure. Now, the first part we can relate to. God is infinite. God is above. This is what Aristotle signed up for. But this below beyond all measure, this infinite God is below beyond all measure. And what the Kabbalists point out is that we don't say regarding Hashem, bli gvul, which means beyond limitation, infinite. Because infinite is also a limitation. Infinite is not finite. Infinite is great and not small. Unlimited and not limited. Rather, we use the term bilti bal gvul, beyond all limitation, which means kishem sheyesh lo koach bebli gvul, kach yesh lo koach b'gvul. Just as his infinite being can exist in an infinite manner, he can exist in a finite manner. And what we end up with is a God who is very involved and who cares and who orchestrates to some extent, obviously not to conflict with free choice. Which brings us to the very famous teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, perhaps one of the most famous teachings of Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence. The Baal Shem Tov talked about divine providence. Things don't happen by coincidence. Obviously, things that are out of our control is what we're talking about. This doesn't take away from free choice. God gives human beings free choice. But those things that are happening that are out of our control are not happening randomly. Rather, they're being orchestrated by Hashgacha Pratis, by this God. Obviously, if God is constantly bringing the world into existence, then God is giving purpose to what's happening with that existence. I want to share with you a tiny little Hashgacha Pratis. So Rabbi Feinstein called me, I believe it was in November, and gave me a bunch of dates and said, I'd like you to come give a talk. And we talked about this date and that date, and finally we decided on January 16th. I realized last week the Hashgacha Pratis, the divine providence, today happens to be Yud Shvat, the 10th day of Shvat, which is a great day in the Chabad community. It is the yard site of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, and it's the day when the 7th Rebbe, my Rebbe, assumed the leadership. And obviously, the Rebbe would be very proud of a gathering like this, of Jews coming together, Jews of all backgrounds and all levels of knowledge, in order to be inspired and to study Torah. So that's a small example of Hashgacha Pratis. Now, when you have this sense of Hashgacha Pratis, that we stay away from the randomness, you end up with a sense that when things are out of your control, you can put them in someone's hands. I'll tell you a personal story. I'm from New Orleans. My parents went through Hurricane Katrina. There's actually a book coming out called Escape from Katrina about the story of my parents during Hurricane Katrina. I don't think it's for sale here. And they actually came back to New Orleans a few weeks after Hurricane Katrina. The place was a war zone. I don't know if you can imagine what it's like when a city sits in 6, 7, 8, 12 feet of water. I mean, the place was just completely destroyed. My parents happened to live in a little strip of the city that wasn't completely destroyed. It was just badly damaged. So they came back right after Rosh Hashanah. They were there Yom Kippur and Sukkot. They built a sukkah. Many Jews came to eat in the sukkah. And my mother was going crazy. Every little thing was just stressful. So many things were out of control. You needed help with anything. The weight, the bureaucracy. It was very, very difficult to function. And she reached out to her brother, Rabbi Josh Gordon, the late Rabbi Josh Gordon, who ran Chabad of Encino of blessed memory. I'm sure many of you knew him, met him. Very special man, very wise man. She reached out to him and she said, I need some advice. I need some help. There's so many things that are just going crazy. I don't know what to do. My mother's name is Bluma. And she says, Bluma, and he says, Bluma, here's what you need to do. Make 2 lists. One list you should call Bluma's list, and one list you should call God's list. All the things that you can control go on Bluma's list. All the things that are out of your control, you put on God's list. And you know with Hashgacha Pratis that whatever God wants to take place with those things is what's going to take place. What an incredible idea. What an incredible concept. How much stress do we experience because of things that are out of our control? But when we begin to think about, we begin to realize, we contemplate that there's a purpose to what's happening around us. It's an incredibly empowering idea, and it can really help the human being. Now, what's interesting is, until what we've said now, God is very, very lofty, and God is also very involved. But in fact, what the Kabbalists teach us is that the main focus and the main purpose of God's creation is not necessarily in the lofty, not necessarily in the sacred and in the holy, but it's in the things that are taking place on the lowest level. Look for a moment at text number 7 from the Tanya, chapter 33, a fascinating text. The purpose of the creation of every person and of all the worlds is to make a sacred dwelling place in this lower world. Imagine for a moment you have a fellow. For many years, he and his wife and children lived in a little house, struggling because they had no space. And then he gets an inheritance. You know what they say, when there's a will, there's a relative. All right? Gets an inheritance. And he calls up his friend, the contractor, and he says, we're going to build a nice big house so that my family has space to breathe and space to live. And they call in the architect and the designer, and they draw up the blueprints and the electrical codes, and very complex. A lot of intelligence, a lot of talent going into this process. And then the contractors come and the subcontractors come, and they're building and they're wiring, and everything is being done perfectly. Very lofty. And then the house is complete, and the family spends their first night in the house, and the next morning they get up and they have breakfast around the breakfast table, and they get into a fight, because that's what families do sometimes. Now you ask yourself a question. Which is more meaningful? The family eating breakfast, or the architect, the designer, the complexity of the home? The answer is, lofty is the design. Meaningful is breakfast. Because the design without the breakfast is meaningless. The breakfast takes place here in this world. The decisions, the challenges that human beings face here in this world is what's most meaningful when we talk about the purpose of creation. So in summary, what we say is like this. Number 1, we are to have a personal, intimate relationship with our Judaism in a very meaningful fashion. Number 2, because what's important happens down here in this world, what we do is most important. I'm sure you've heard this. Judaism is less about faith and more about faithfulness, doing the right thing, because it is down here in this world, in this physical existence, where purpose is realized. And finally, just a few more moments of your time. Let's talk about the unique perspective that Hasidus gives us in how we view humanity, ourselves and others. Of course, starting with the Torah, text number 8, we have the famous words of Rabbi Akiva on the verse in Deuteronomy, text number 8 on page 3, love your fellow as yourself. Rabbi Akiva said, this is a great principle of the Torah. Taking that a step further, we have a text number 9, where there is this very important custom brought down in the Sephardic Siddurim, including the Chabad Siddur, where it says, the Alter Rebbe writes in his Siddur, it is proper to say before prayer, I hereby take upon myself to fulfill the mitzvah, love your fellow as yourself. Love your fellow as yourself is the gateway through which a human being can approach spiritual growth. And so we have this tremendous prominence in how we see another person. But let's try to understand this a little bit. Okay, I know that I'm supposed to see another person, but come on, I see the other person. I'm judgmental about the other person. The other person doesn't make good decisions, and they're unpleasant sometimes, and they make mistakes. And I don't love the other person. What am I supposed to do? So here we have something very, very beautiful. Look at text number 10. It's a fascinating text, one of the most powerful texts in Hasidic writings. The Talmud says, a very famous section of the Talmud, quoted by Steven Spielberg in Schindler's List, whoever saves a single person is as though they saved an entire world. And the question is, why? It's one person. It's not an entire world. So here's what Rabbi Schneur Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, once told his son. He said, when you perceive another, when you see another person, you should perceive them as they stand in the primordial thought of Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon is a term in Kabbalah. It is the thought, the dream that God has, the vision of creation, which encompasses all of creation. And with each individual, there is the vision of that individual and everything they could possibly accomplish. And that's the way we should see our fellow human being. We should see them as they are in that state of potential. Interesting idea. But what does that really mean? So allow me to share with you an example from science, from the scientific world. There's this very fascinating concept called pluripotency of our cells, of our human cells. The way it works is like this. And again, there's probably experts here who understand this better than me, but this is the way I understand it. When a fetus is first conceived, for the first 5 days, all of the cells of that existence are pluripotent. They have the ability, they have the potential to be every single part of a human being, from skin cell to the complexity of a brain and everything in between. They're pluripotent. And after about 5 days, the cells begin to divide and they begin to develop. And so to speak, each cell is assigned a portion of the human body. So they're no longer pluripotent. And then you have a human being develops and is born and hopefully lives happily ever after. In 2007, there was a group of professors, a group of scientists, who thought to themselves, so what happened to the pluripotency of the cells? Has it disappeared? Or perhaps it lies dormant within the cell? So here's what they did. They were able to recreate the genetic environment of those first 5 days in a laboratory. And they took some of the cells and they put it into that genetic environment. And amazingly, they rediscovered their pluripotency. The cells once again became pluripotent. This is incredible. These two professors actually received the Nobel Prize in 2012. And the excitement in the medical community is tremendous, because think of the possibilities where you could take someone's skin cells, and from those skin cells you could grow brain cells, You could create blood for blood transfusions. I mean, the possibilities are endless. Just in the last few years, they are already beginning to use offshoots of this discovery to treat Parkinson's disease. There's a young man in our community who's being treated for cancer with an offshoot of this discovery. Amazing, fascinating. We thought the cell had lost its potential, had lost its pluripotency, and really all it needs is to be in that original inspirational environment, and it rediscovers its own potential. Now, of course, as a rabbi, you read this, you can't help but think about the potential of the soul. Every soul begins in Adam Kadmon, as we read. In God's mind, every soul begins with incredible potential. And then we're born, and children have a lot of potential. We see a lot of potential in children. And then we grow up, and we begin to settle, and we begin to drop this dream and that dream, and we're told you can't do this and you can't do that, and the boss fires you, and therefore you can't accomplish this, and so on. And we become human beings who, to some extent, we've lost some of our potential. And that's the way people feel. But if you can somehow take the soul and put it back into that nurturing environment, it can rediscover its own pluripotency. And what I want to share with you is that when it comes to the philosophy of Hasidus and how we are to inspire and encourage a fellow human being, a fellow Jew, to be more inspired, to be more involved, to study more, to be more passionate, to feel more connected. If you take this idea to mind, all you need to do, the first thing you need to do, the most important thing you need to do, is put them in the environment that inspires the soul. Put them in that space where the soul can be inspired. Put them in a space where they are welcomed. Put them in a space where they are not judged. And put them in a space where they're offered spirituality, tradition. And don't be afraid to share with them tradition, undiluted tradition, because it is that tradition that will help to reawaken the soul. Very interesting from Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers. Aaron, the high priest, a lover of Israel, a lover of human beings. What does it say? Text number 12, page 5. We're almost done. Hillel would say, be of the disciples of Aaron, a lover of peace, a pursuer of peace, one who loves creatures and draws them close to the Torah. Now, if you think about it, it's not very nice to call people creatures. What are you calling them creatures? Call them people. So Rabbi Schneur Zalman writes in his Tanya, in his book of Tanya, he says, even a human being who seems to be so low spiritually that their only virtue is that God created them, that person we call a creature, that's their compliment. You were created. You're one of God's creatures. Even such a person you are to love and you are to bring close. But how do you bring them close? They're so distant. They're so far. They're lacking the knowledge. They're lacking the passion. They're not comfortable in the traditional Jewish environment. How are you going to bring them close? Maybe what you need to do, and perhaps there's some wisdom to this, is you need to take the Torah and bring it a little bit closer to them. But that's not what he says. He says, Umakarvam la Torah, bring them closer to the Torah. Perhaps the reason is because a soul needs that pluripotent environment in order to be reinvigorated. And that environment can only be realized when the Torah stays where it's supposed to be and the person is lovingly, in a non-judgmental fashion, drawn closer. And that's an interesting formula which should be explored. To conclude, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidus, said, when you see a fellow human being, and certainly as Jewish people, we're all one mishpacha, we're all one family. When you see a fellow Jew, you should remember that God loves every person as parents love an only child born to them miraculously in old age. Think of the love that parents have for any child, certainly for an only child. How much more so for an only child born to them after years of yearning to have a child. And that's the way God loves every human being. And I want to conclude with this story. This story took place in Jerusalem several years ago. There's a rabbi in Jerusalem who runs a unique yeshiva, a unique school for young men who grew up in a religious environment, and for whatever reason, they decided to abandon their religious practices, and they're now living a secular life in Israel. And he created this school as a place to make them feel comfortable, give them the opportunity at their own pace to explore Judaism without some of the pressures that are present sometimes in some of the yeshivas and some of the religious schools. A very unique school. One day, this rabbi and his wife experienced a terrible tragedy. Their 6-year-old son failed to wake up one morning. They lost their son. Terrible tragedy. They're sitting Shiva, the 7 days of mourning, and there are a number of rabbis that are sitting with them, trying to console them. And in walks a number of their students, a number of the students from this school. Now remember, these were boys who had grown up in religious homes, observing kashrut, observing Shabbat scrupulously. And now, for whatever reason, they've left that behind. And they come in and they're sitting with the rabbi and they're talking to him. And as they're about to leave, the rabbi says, I'd like to ask you to do a mitzvah in memory of my son. And they say, of course, Rabbi, we're happy to do that. And they get together and they talk and they come back and they say, Rabbi, we decided we have not kept Shabbos properly for many years. We're going to observe one Shabbos in memory of your son. Beautiful. Some of the other rabbis who were there say to the man sitting Shiva after the boys left, really? All they could give you was one Shabbos? Couldn't they take on Shabbos observance permanently in honor of your son? And the rabbi looks at them and says, let me tell you what it's like to lose a son. It's horrible. It's painful. He says, I miss my son terribly, but I especially miss him on Shabbos. Do you know what I would do to have my son back for one Shabbos? To have him sitting at the Friday night table, we would sing Shalom Aleichem and make Kiddush together. And I would hear him say words of Torah at the table. And then the next morning I would wake him up and we'd walk to shul together hand in hand. You know what I would give to have my son for one Shabbos? I would give everything in the world. He says, do you know what it means to our Father in heaven that his boys come back to him for one Shabbos? And you question the meaning of that gesture? That means the world to our Father in heaven, to God. And this is something that I'd like to leave you with, because Hasidus teaches us the infinite, eternal power of a single mitzvah, of a single act of kindness, of a single act of holiness, of a tefillin, of a Shabbos, of an act of charity. That single mitzvah, it's not about changing the world or changing your life. It's about doing a single act, because in the eyes of Hashem, in the eyes of God, we have infinite potential, and we are beloved like an only child. And with that, I'd like to conclude with a blessing. May we, the Jewish nation, and the entire world experience children coming back to their father's table. May we experience the peace that the world so desperately needs with the imminent coming of Mashiach. Amen. Thank you.
You need to know. If the prayer comes true and Mashiach comes in the next 15 minutes, we will all gather in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, for a wonderful celebration. But if it shouldn't happen, there's coffee and cookies outside. Have a coffee, have a cookie, come back in about 5 minutes, and we'll continue our conversation with Rav Rivkin. Thank you. Amen, amen. Vodka would be good in any case, but please take a few minutes, have a coffee, have a cookie, meet us back here. We'll continue. Thank you. That was just beautiful. Just beautiful. The way you look. Hi. Nava Tehillah. Yeah, they're a very famous Israeli singing group, a rock music group. that does a beautiful Friday night in Jerusalem every summer, all Friday night during the summer, and they're doing a world tour, so we get to enjoy Shabbos with them. Yeah, come, 7:30.
Thank you.
Hey, Rick, thanks so much. Is that your way? Tell them you good? There's cookies, help yourself, okay? Come have some.
We're going to start. Ah. You were late, so you have to catch up. You have to eat more.
Call me out in front of everybody.
I can't get no satisfaction. Good evening. Please come have a seat. Come on back. It's cold in here now.
Oh, that's okay.
No. On the contrary, it was a joy. Very, very nice. Really nice teaching. Thank you. Please come have a seat. Come have a seat. I want to make sure that the air conditioning, for some reason, it just got cold over here. No, I fixed it. I got the. Good evening. Good evening. Please come have a seat. How are the cookies? Good? Yeah? All right, once again, we're delighted that all of you came out during the rain and the snow and the sleet and the hail and came to learn with us. And a very special welcome to Rabbi Rivkin. And we want to welcome Rabbi Rivkin's son, Shalom, is here. And Shalom, hi. Thank you for coming to learn with us. It's an honor to have you in our shul. It's our custom to have a few questions and answers. I'll ask a few questions, and then I think the community has a few questions. And really appreciate your teaching and your forthrightness. And I have lots and lots and lots of questions. So let me begin at the end and sort of work our way backwards. At the very end, you offered a beautiful prayer. And part of that prayer was a prayer for Mashiach. This is a theme that you hear Chabad rabbis speak about a lot. This idea that Mashiach, and it's with a sense of imminence, a sense of like it's going to happen any day now. And I know that's not common among, for example, say Orthodox rabbis or even other Hasidic rabbis. So where does this belief in Mashiach, who is the Mashiach for you? What does it mean to believe in Mashiach? And how does that shape your faith? Simple question.
It's way beyond my pay grade.
No.
It's a great question. It's very important. No, I think it's important to recognize that, as I said earlier, regarding many of the teachings of Hasidus in general, Hasidut or Chabad Hasidus, this is not about innovating new ideas, but about perhaps re-energizing existing ideas that had become less popular or less talked about. If you look at Maimonides, who's considered one of the foundational codifiers of Jewish law, he talks very clearly and very openly about the importance, the centrality of the belief in an era of goodness and redemption where the world realizes its pluripotent potential. And he says this is a central theme of Judaism, and that's really where it comes from. And Maimonides does put an imminence into it. There's imminence in other places in Judaism. There's a prayer that we say, many prayers that we say every day in the Shemona Esrei, in the Amidah, in the standing prayer. Et Tzemach David Avtecha Mehera Tatzmiach. Please bring Mashiach now, immediately, Mehera, right? Very quickly. And so these are not new ideas, but these are ideas that perhaps were re-energized through Hasidus in general. The Baal Shem Tov talked about the purpose of the Hasidic teachings is to help prepare the world for the coming of Mashiach. Maimonides says at the very end of his book of laws, at the end of the Mishnah Torah, he says, what are we going to do when Mashiach comes? No mortgages, no anti-Semitism. Israel's going to be safe. What are we going to do? He says, we're going to study Torah. And so in a sense, what we're doing right now is we're experiencing a taste of Mashiach. When people come together in oneness, in unity, in friendship, and they learn the Torah in general, especially when they learn the mystical teachings of the Torah, this is what Maimonides says we're going to do with the coming of Mashiach. So how do we experience Mashiach? Experiencing Mashiach means to experience one's potential, one's spiritual potential, one's divine potential. And so it's a very central theme in Judaism.
I was very, very taken with your discussion of hashgacha pratit. I speak the other Hebrew, so personal providence, is that the right word? This idea that you said of, you control what you can control and everything else you leave to God.
Yes.
And your notion that at least as you articulated it, a deep belief that God orchestrates things in the world and things have purpose in the world.
Yes.
That's a beautiful belief. I mean, it's wonderful to say that we picked this day because it's an auspicious day in the calendar of the Hasidic community, and I appreciate that. And there are moments when that kind of a teaching fills us with strength and purpose and warmth. But there are also moments when that kind of a teaching can rebound and become very hurtful. If something horrible happens, and one says, well, where is the God who is supposed to be protecting me?
Yes.
Is God responsible for this horrible thing? Is God punishing me because with this illness or this loss or this misfortune? And that's when that belief becomes difficult. So how do you deal with that part?
First of all, hashgacha pratis means that there's a deeper purpose to things that are happening. And I think hashgacha pratis can actually be very meaningful and even more relevant when you're experiencing a difficulty. Meaning when everything is well and everything is wonderful, okay, it's God, it's luck. That's a great thing. It's especially when things are difficult and things are challenging and the person feels alone and the suffering feels senseless. It's especially then when it can be comforting, also challenging, and it's a very Jewish thing to challenge God. Abraham challenged injustice, perceived injustice. Moses challenged perceived injustice. All the great sages, part of believing in God is being bothered by the perceived injustices. But it's also a very comforting feeling that you're not alone and that you're not abandoned to coincidence and to senseless suffering. Knowing that there's a purpose, knowing that there's some sort of plan or orchestration, even if we can't understand it, as painful as it is, for many people, that's actually very comforting.
But for many people, that imposes a tremendous burden, say, of guilt.
Right.
If there's the Torah says that, when I do mitzvot, I'm rewarded, and when I fail to do mitzvot, when I commit sins, I'm punished. So a person comes and says, Rebbe, am I being punished? Is this illness or my family's misfortune, is it a punishment from God? How can I worship a God who would punish me with a thing like that? I mean, how do you deal with that?
So, I mean, as we know, although there is this notion of punishment or consequence, but that's not the explanation to everything. There are things that happen that have nothing to do with punishment. They have to do with other reasons, other circumstances. I mean, just the opposite is stated, where it says that, that God allows sometimes the wicked to enjoy this world, so that, so to speak, they won't enjoy as much in the next world. Again, you can interpret that as you wish. So you have two sides of the coin, and it's not necessarily the case that just because a person is suffering that it's connected with punishment. And that's certainly not the approach that we should take, because we don't know. We ultimately don't know. We don't understand many of God's ways. And I understand that it can be comforting, and that there are people who take the approach and they say, look, God is simply not involved, or God simply isn't able to help you. And, but that's not the approach that's taken from the perspective of hashgacha pratis. Hashgacha pratis means that there is an involvement and there is a purpose, and it does create challenges. It creates a sense of injustice at times, but it's also very comforting. It can be very comforting as well.
Yeah. So let's take a related topic, which is the power of prayer. I think both of us as rabbis have often had experience when someone is in difficulty, loved one is ill, and someone will come to us and say, I want to say a prayer to make them better.
Right.
Does prayer work in that way?
It's interesting.
How do you answer that person's question?
The word prayer in Hebrew is tefillah. Tefillah is connected to a word in the Mishnah where the Mishnah says tofel. Tofel means to weld, to bring two things together, to create a connection. And from the perspective of the mystics, from the Kabbalistic, Hasidic perspective, prayer is much less about asking for assistance, and it's more about re-energizing a connection. And essentially, when we pray for someone, or we say to someone who's suffering to pray, what we're saying to them is, strengthen your connection. Strengthen the connection with your soul. Strengthen the connection with your Creator, because that will help you endure in the suffering. So it's really a self-help in a sense. Obviously, there is the idea that you're talking to God, and that's part of it, but it's not the focus of prayer. In fact, most of our prayers are not about asking for things. If you think about it, if you actually read the prayers, there's really only one section where we ask for things. Most of prayer is actually describing God's world, describing the grandeur, the wonder of nature, of the physical world, and then we talk about the angels and the spiritual world. And the purpose of that is to develop a feeling of love, a feeling of awe, and to desire to have a connection. And that's ultimately what prayer is about.
But does it work? The part that's bakasha, that's petitionary, if there is hashgacha pratit, can I litigate hashgacha pratit? Can I place a petition in front of the ruler and say, if it's all the same to you, let the Rams win on Sunday, sorry.
That, my friend, is not going to happen. And I will pray. Yes. I'll tell you a true story.
What's the gematria of Drew Brees? That's what I want to know.
I'll tell you a true story. There's a game every year in New Orleans called the Sugar Bowl.
Yes.
People come in for the Sugar Bowl. So my parents started the Habad in New Orleans for Tulane University. Wow. And there was a student, many, many years ago, there was a student from Panama who somehow, I guess he went to school somewhere else, and his team was playing in the Sugar Bowl. Now, he was already becoming closer to Judaism, becoming more religious, and I guess the Sugar Bowl was on Shabbos. I'm not sure if it's still on Shabbos. And my father was trying to convince him not to go to the game, to stay in shul and to do the right thing and so on and so forth. And ultimately, he couldn't do it. He went to the game, and his team lost terribly. And the next Friday night, he came, and he had a couple of chayims, and he kept saying, "Rabbi, you prayed. It's not fair. You prayed." Right? That's what he said. Anyway, look, I think definitely if you look at the stories of Abraham and Moses, negotiating with God, there can be that conversation with Hashem, that conversation with God. Are you guaranteed to have the answer that you're asking for? Not necessarily. It's interesting. We can sometimes look at our relationship with Hashem as a small child with a parent. A parent is always ready to listen to their child. But ultimately, there are things that parents know. Shalom, are you listening? Ultimately, there are things that parents know that simply cannot be explained to a child. And so as much as the parent loves the child and cares for the child and is bothered by the child's cries, sometimes the answer is no, because that's what's best for the child. And sometimes that's our relationship with God. And so God listens to our prayers, and he caresses our hand, and he gives us a hug, and he says, as you cry, I'm with you, and I feel your pain. But for whatever reason, this is what's happening right now. And we can't always understand.
I think many of us have had the experience of walking by a Chabad sort of kiosk in the mall or on the street, and a couple of young men will ask you if you've put on film, right? And if you look vaguely Jewish, and if you demur even for a moment before you can say, Chabad Chassid, bam, there's tefillin on you. I'm interested in that ritual, and I'm interested in that move, and I'm interested in how you understand that, and I'm really deeply more interested in really the Chabad, or your take on mitzvah,
yes,
on the purpose of mitzvah, what mitzvah does in this world and another world, why a person would do a mitzvah. He doesn't even really know what he's doing,
right?
And they're throwing on tefillin before they even explain to him what this is. Help us understand that.
I think we understand when it comes to mitzvahs that are about tikkun olam, making the world into a better place, we understand what the purpose of those mitzvahs are, because those are mitzvahs that we can relate to as human beings. Mm-hmm. The question is really with regards to rituals. The word mitzvah means commandment. Chassidus takes the word mitzvah and gives a slightly different twist. The word mitzvah is connected to the Aramaic word tzavta. Tzavta means chavura, like your chavura in the synagogue. A tzavta is a group of people who are closely connected. The word mitzvah means connection. You've heard of the term schar mitzvah, mitzvah? The reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah? According to this interpretation, what we're saying is the reward of a mitzvah is a connection. A mitzvah is about creating a connection, about reinvigorating the soul that gets concealed through our day-to-day human experiences. A mitzvah, using the scientific example that we gave earlier, is about allowing that cell that has lost or that has been disconnected from its potential to experience some of that potent state and maybe to be reconnected. And from that perspective, obviously doing a mitzvah when you understand what the mitzvah is and when you have passion for the mitzvah is the most beautiful thing. It's very, very special. But doing a mitzvah for the sake of doing a mitzvah, the connection is there. The connection is still there. You know, the Talmud says if you're walking down the street and you lose a $100 bill, you drop a $100 bill, you say, forget about it. There's no way I'm going to find it. Okay? A poor person picks it up and survives for a couple of days. On that inadvertent, unintentional act of charity, you've done a mitzvah. Why? Because the person had a couple of meals. The deed was done. It's the same thing with regards to rituals. Now, obviously, again, the best thing is to take the opportunity to explain to the person what tefillin is. And by the way, we do that even at those booths. You know, we have this elevator pitch. As you're wrapping the tefillin, to explain to them what it is and to try to give them a very basic connection, and that's very meaningful. But there is the sense that just doing the mitzvah has a spiritual impact upon the person. Just to share a very short story, there's during the times of communism, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose yahrzeit was today, the 10th day of Shvat, he would deal very closely with many of the leaders of the Jewish Communist Party, many of whom actually came from Hasidic families. And one day they came to him and they said, Rabbi, we've heard you're a very convincing teacher. We're going to give you a week. You can talk to us, you can say to us whatever you like. And you need to convince us to come back to Judaism. And he said, deal. But first, you need to spend 1 week eating kosher food and putting on tefillin every day. Why? Because he believed, and I believe, that when a Jew does a mitzvah, their soul is awakened. The sensitivity of their soul is heightened. And then when you speak to them and you try to inspire them and be makar of them and bring them a little bit closer, they're more open to the idea. And so that's the purpose of just getting someone to do a mitzvah.
We'll be with you in a minute, okay?
I will share with you that there are many, many, tens of thousands of people around the world whose initial contact, the beginning of a long, beautiful journey into greater involvement in Judaism, started with a tefillin interaction somewhere on a street in the world. So there is the long-term impact of the tefillin reaction, of the tefillin interaction, of the Jewish woman being given Shabbos candles and being told, light these candles tonight, right? That begins a process very often, which leads to much more beautiful things.
Good. Thank you. My name is Feinstein, as you know, which means I come from the other side. The Feinsteins were the great Litvak community, and my rabbinic ancestors were no friends of the Hasidic community. And one of the things that not me, but my ancestors. So one of the things that my ancestors had a problem with was the way that the Hasidic community gathered around a Rebbe and elevated the Rebbe to something, can we say, even more than human. And sometimes I sense that in certain Chabad circles as well.
Sure.
So for you, if that's okay, I'm going to be sensitive here.
Absolutely.
Tell us who the Rebbe is to you.
It's interesting. You use the term elevating a person more than human. Kabbalah argues that every human being is more than human. We have a soul, right? Human means you have a body, you have desires, you have passions, you have self-centeredness. That's what human means. Soul is to transcend your humanity. So, in a sense, every human being is more than just human from the mystical perspective.
Fair enough.
Now, we also believe, going back to people like Moses, that there were individuals, either as a result of their own toil or as a way of God giving the people the inspiration that's needed for that particular generation. There were individuals whose soul, which is their above humanness, is a more powerful soul or a more connected soul or a soul that is able to sense things or appreciate things that the average individual can't necessarily appreciate. And that's essentially what a Rebbe is. But I'll tell you, for me personally, I mean, the Rebbe was, and to a large extent is, a tremendous inspiration in my life. And it's not so much about the supernatural and the miracles. And for me, the Rebbe was a person who gave up so much for the sake of others. I mean, it's hard to imagine the dedication of the Rebbe to his community. I mean, literally a person who lived such a simple life and had access to so much, and yet lived so simply and worked so hard without taking a break, literally, on behalf of others. I mean, I remember as a child witnessing the Rebbe almost 90 years old. Almost 90 years old. I'll tell you one incredible thing that I remember. The Rebbe was almost 90 years old. He was 89 years old. This was 1992. 88 years old. It was his wife's yahrzeit. And he went and spent many hours at her graveside and at the graveside of his Rebbe, who was buried nearby. Came home in the evening. The custom is when you go to a cemetery, when you go to visit the grave of a Rebbe, you don't eat, you fast. And so he had been fasting the entire day. There was a special booklet, a special Hasidic teaching that had been published for that day. And the Rebbe decided, instead of just publishing it, he wants to personally hand a copy of that book to anyone who wants. You could imagine what a privilege that was. Thousands of people lined up. And he stood for many, many hours, fasting, giving out that book. The dedication, the love, the kindness. To me, that's what the Rebbe is. You know, a person, an example of a person who's able to truly care about other people, to truly be dedicated to other people, and a person who's very, very powerful, but empowers others, doesn't make others feel small, empowers others. It's a very, very inspirational thing. So that's a perspective on the Rebbe.
Will there be another? It's been some years, right? And I know that many revere him and still really feel like he's still very, very present in the midst of the movement. Will there be another individual who will rise up and take a place?
A prophet I'm not, okay? I don't know, but I will tell you that if a Rebbe is teachings and the Rebbe is inspiration, we have many, many great righteous people who are physically not here for many years, whose teachings and inspiration continue to inspire us. Right. You have Moshe Rabbeinu, you have the Rambam, Rashi, many great people, the Baal Shem Tov, who we quoted tonight. Certainly there's a very, very strong sense of inspiration, of teachings. If one of the things that the Rebbe accomplished was to inspire young people to dedicate their lives to the service of tiny Jewish communities in far-flung places around the world, the Rebbe continues to inspire that. His energy, his inspiration, his teachings continue to inspire that.
Yeah. So one last, this is a personal question, and then I promise you I'm done. I only have 20,000 more, but you know the rabbis here. So, as you said, many of your colleagues, I'm sure even members of your family, are sent to far-flung communities, and you were sent to the wasteland of Northridge.
I got lucky.
Well, yeah, I mean, in a certain way, yes. In a certain way, yes, and in a certain way, no. And that's sort of what I want to ask you, which is, if you were the Chabad rabbi in some godforsaken corner of the world, you would have a certain set of challenges.
Yes.
What are the challenges that face you in Northridge?
It's an interesting question. I would say the greatest challenge in Northridge is how much work needs to be done. I grew up in a relatively small Jewish community in New Orleans. Until today, if my parents hear of someone from New Orleans, chances are they knew them at some point.
Right.
It's a relatively small community. There are probably more Jews within walking distance of this synagogue than in the entire state of Louisiana. Okay? So for me, one of the greatest challenges in Northridge is that the mandate of a Chabad Shliach is that you're not just there for the attendees of your shul or for the members of your community. You have a sense of responsibility for every Jew who needs help, who needs assistance, whether it's physical assistance, financial assistance, and certainly spiritual assistance. And so the level, the volume of work, the things that are yet to be done is sometimes overwhelming. As much as we accomplish, and together with our wonderful community, I think we accomplish a lot, there's always a sense that we're just scratching the surface. And there are so many more people who we still have to reach. So that, I would say, is probably the biggest challenge.
I appreciate that. I appreciate your candor, too.
Yeah.
Let's take a few minutes. Bill's going to grab the microphone. Louise is across the country at a wedding, I think, right? Or a simcha tonight, and so we want to give our love to Louise. And so we have the microphone. You can ask a question, and I want to ask you all, because you know my rule. We have a minhag here. A question is a single-sentence interrogatory, right? That begins with what, where, why, when, and how, and engages our guests to answer. So to give speeches, we can do that a little bit later, but we have
that will become a Northridge rule next week, by the way. It's a
well,
great
just
rule.
because we have a few precious moments to share with the rabbi. Norm, please.
Does you mentioned Tikkun Olam and the Chabad?
Yes.
Does the Tikkun Olam extend beyond the Jewish community? Does it? In our understanding, it goes beyond to the world. I only hear from you the interest of the Tikkun of the Chabad in the Jewish community.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. We as Jews have a responsibility to assist any human being in need. But the Torah does say, with regards to tzedakah, which is the foundation of Tikkun Olam, helping others, giving to others, that there is a circle of priorities. If a person has limited funds, how should they prioritize their tzedakah? And it talks about your family, your local community, and then other communities. And I think there's a sense within the Jewish world that we are mishpacha, we are family, and therefore we have a responsibility to help our family, certainly, but no question we also have a responsibility to the greater world and to all of society. According to Jewish law, according to Maimonides, we actually have a responsibility to teach and to inspire the world, to assist them, to help them in creating a just and civilized world. It's one of the mitzvahs that we have. The reason why for many generations we didn't fulfill this mitzvah is because it was dangerous to fulfill this mitzvah. To try to influence non-Jewish populations under anti-Semitism was dangerous, but we certainly have that responsibility now. In the 1980s, the Rebbe started a very vigorous campaign directed to Chabad emissaries to perform outreach to the general population as well. And so that's certainly something we try to do. Look, in general, Chabad is primarily focused on teaching and inspiration. That's the primary focus of the work that we do, and that extends, of course, to Jews and to non-Jews. When it comes to other causes, certainly as individuals, we get involved in causes that are important. But there are many other organizations that are involved in wonderful causes, and we encourage people to get involved with organizations for whom that's their primary focus. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Yes, could you explain the structure of Chabad, how people are given assignments, how it's financed? Just to give us a thumbnail sketch of the whole organization.
How much time do I have? So first of all, it's a very organized structure. you basically have regions all over the world, and each region has its administrator who's responsible for making sure that the needs of the population in that particular region are taken care of. And when the need arises for additional staff, it goes through that particular region. Even during the times when the Rebbe was physically involved in the process, it was almost never the Rebbe sending someone to a particular place. It was, like for example, in the case of my parents, they went out in the early 1970s. They did their research with the different regional directors. They came up with a number of different ideas. And of course, they asked the Rebbe for his advice and for his blessing. In terms of how things are financed, it's a very interesting question. The answer is the Rebbe felt, and it works pretty well, that each Chabad is to be financed by its local community. And in that sense, anything which the community is investing in its Chabad stays within the community. And the reason why it's worked very well is because you end up with a situation that even if there's a challenge happening in one Chabad, it doesn't necessarily bring down others as well. Each one is operating independently, and it's up to the community to create the particular type of organization that they'd like to create and to support. So pretty much nothing is sent from headquarters, and nothing is sent to headquarters. Each Chabad is funded independently.
How many shlichim are there in the world?
The latest number I heard is 4,900. It changes daily, so it's hard to keep up with it.
But that's usually couples, so it's 4,900
4,900 couples. You know, it's interesting. Chabad is an organization where 50% of its corporate leadership is women. I don't know if you have that in other Jewish organizations, so that's an interesting number.
Because you're sent as a couple to a community.
Yes, and it's clearly a partnership. Every Chabad is most strongly influenced by its female leader. The rabbis just get too much of the credit, but most of the credit certainly goes to the Rebbitzins and all of their hard work.
I hope your wife is watching.
I hope so too.
Good. Steve, hi.
Quick request, since neither of you have a dog in the fight of the AFC Championship, could you at least say a little prayer for the Kansas City Chiefs? That's all I really would like that.
A silent prayer has been offered.
My question, though, is do they still have arranged marriages in the Hasidic community? And if so, what makes them seemingly so successful?
I'm not the expert on the Hasidic community, and I'm not a shadchan. But I will tell you, if arranged marriages means a young couple is told who to marry, then the answer is no. If arranged marriages means something along the lines of eharmony.com, where basically you let someone know what you're interested in, and others do some of the vetting for you, so you avoid some of that process, which can be very difficult and very emotional, then the answer is yes. So there is a process where before the dating process actually begins, much of the work has been done in terms of finding out the really important things. We know that one of the challenges that young people face is they often get romantically involved before finding out important things about the other person. And then once you're romantically involved, it's hard to make decisions that are rational because you're romantically involved. What we try and do is get most of the important things in place so that once the romance is sparked, it's a healthy relationship from the perspective of having shared values. Yeah.
Good. Who's got the mic?
I do.
Yes, please.
It was recently brought up that the Pew Bulletin indicated that the numbers of Jews that are marrying out of the faith and then not raising their families and not choosing to be Jewish is at such a high rate that within maybe 4 decades, there will be no more Jews as we know Jews today. Do you agree, disagree? Do you see some solution to this?
My faith does not allow me to agree that Judaism is going to disappear. Abraham was promised that his children will live forever. Are there things that we can do? I think some of the things we talked about earlier. about creating a Judaism that is passionate. I think it's important to, obviously we want to be rational, and rational includes being skeptical at times. But if Judaism is just or is primarily about skepticism, about the things that Jews have in their tradition, it's very hard to be passionate about skepticism. It's much easier to be passionate about something that you feel is yours and is who you are and actually belongs to you. Right. It's interesting. You know, one of the most beautiful things, I think, for any community is a Jew by choice. Why? Because a Jew by choice is a person who was not forced to be Jewish. Nobody told them to be Jewish. They, on their own, decided to choose Judaism. And that's why the Torah gives an extra mitzvah. In addition to loving your fellow, v'ahavtam et hager, you should love the convert, because that is the ultimate complement to Judaism. You know, I think in a sense, all American Jews are Jews by choice. Nobody forces us to be Jewish. There used to be a time where society forced you to be Jewish, anti-Semitism forced you to be Jewish, discrimination forced you to be Jewish, your parents forced you to be Jewish. Nobody forces you to be Jewish. And so the Jews who choose to be Jewish are the most incredible Jews. The Jews who choose to be Jewish today are Jews by choice. And that takes a lot of passion and a lot of knowledge, right? And so we need to celebrate those Jews, especially young Jews, who are choosing to be Jewish. I will tell you, from my personal experience, I have the privilege of interacting with many, many young Jews. We have a very active teen group. The students love to talk about spirituality. They love to talk about the neshama. They want to know what's happening. What does Judaism say? What's happening deep inside? And so I always tell people, don't be afraid to share things that are important to you. Don't be afraid to share your values with your children. If they're shared passionately, if they're shared sincerely, things that come from the heart, enter the heart. And I think that's the answer. Be passionate, be sincere, and do what you're doing tonight. Be knowledgeable. Teach Judaism.
What is the Chabad attitude toward converts, to people coming for conversion? Is there a derech for that?
Of course, it's the traditional derech that has existed since Mount Sinai, when all Jews converted to Judaism.
Yeah.
It's a three-part process. There's circumcision for men, there's mikvah, and there's sincere acceptance of Torah and mitzvahs. Yeah. And when a convert converts in that fashion, they are the pinnacle of the community.
Mm-hmm. Who's got the mic? Yeah, Brian.
First, Rabbi, thank you for coming here tonight and teaching us. I very much appreciate it. Rabbi Feinstein asked you a question about prayers of petition, right? My family member is sick, God please heal him, something like that. And in your answer, you distinguished between like the idea of punishment versus consequences and things like that. I'm curious, in the worldview of Habad, is there a role for random chance? Right? You know, my father-in-law didn't get sick because of God's will. It's just one of those things.
I think it's quite clear, as difficult and painful that it is at times, and as unjust that it sounds at times, that if a person believes that God is constantly re-energizing the world, then how can there be anything left to chance? The only time God steps aside is to allow for free choice. Beyond that, nothing happens by chance. Everything happens for a purpose. Does that mean that we understand everything that happens? Absolutely not. Does that mean that we should endeavor to understand? At times it's cruel to endeavor to understand. And it's inappropriate to endeavor to understand, right? Abraham, when he saw the imminent destruction of Sodom, he didn't come to God and say, you know, God, I think this is why you're doing it. He said, Hashayfet kol haaretz layasa mishpat. Could the judge of the world do such a terrible act of injustice? And so that is the reaction at times. But the underlying belief is that there's a God who orchestrates everything that's happening. as joyous as that is at times, and as painful as it is at times.
Who's got the mic?
I have it.
Oh, where are you? Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Cantor.
Right. Rabbi, at the end of your presentation in the first half, you talked about the difference between bringing the Torah closer and bringing the people closer to the Torah. But you started your presentation with the description of the two young people in northern Florida.
Yes.
Weren't they bringing the Torah closer? And if they weren't, why do you need the messengers?
It's an interesting question. When we talk about bringing the Torah closer, as opposed to bringing the people to the Torah, it's not a secret that there were many well-meaning leaders in previous generations who, in the face of rampant assimilation and disinterest of the community, decided to compromise on some of the basic foundational ideas of Judaism in order to bring people closer. And these were very well-meaning individuals, and they had all of the best intentions. But it seems that Pirkei Avot is discouraging that. And that there are certain things that are bedrock in Judaism. And then obviously there are many things through which Judaism evolves. Right? We live in a Judaism of 2019, not a Judaism of 4,000 years ago. And yet there are things in 2019 that are just as relevant today as they were 4,000 years ago, perhaps even more. Right? When in history have we needed Shabbat more than we need it today? Go to the average home and watch what takes place at dinner, where people don't talk to each other, people don't focus on each other. We desperately need, the world needs Shabbat more than ever before. And needs Shabbat in the traditional sense, where we unplug for 25 hours, right? So when we talk about bedrock of Judaism, that's where we have to bring the people closer to the Torah. Obviously, we innovate and we evolve as is appropriate in order to make Judaism as accessible as possible.
So can you give us an example of that?
Of the innovation and the evolution?
Yeah.
Chabad.org. Right?
Okay.
How's that?
No, so let me. I want to pursue this because I think.
Or
it's
Aish.org or
No, no,
VBS.org.
No, I think it's a beautiful example. No, and Chabad.org, by the way, you should know, they were the first of the great Jewish organizations and movements to really put stuff up online. I mean, long before VBS.org got started, there was great material, and there is wonderful material on Chabad.org. Right? Just wonderful. But I want to ask you, because it'll take us, again, too long, but it's wonderful to be able to ask a very sensitive and wise rabbi. What's the criteria? You said bedrock doesn't change, lots of other things change. Okay. How do you know what to change and what not to change? There are, as you well know, other people, other Hasidim, who would say, Chabad.org is a travesty. That Chabad's engagement with the world in the way that it engages is in fact is diluting it. It's sinful. It's wrong. And then there are others who would look at you from the other side of the world and say, your persona, the things you've taught, these things are not what we should be preserving. So how does Chabad? How do you, as a Chabad Rav, and how does Chabad as a movement make that decision about what to keep and what to change?
Right. I mean, I think there's a difference between what you described in terms of the disagreements with, Chabad and other Hasidic movements. Those are in the realm of hashkafa, in terms of beyond Jewish law, what is appropriate, how conservative should you be, how cloistered of a community should you be, and so on. Right. But those are not in the realm of halacha, of bedrock Jewish law. When we talk about not changing the Torah or changing the Torah, or not changing the Torah, allowing the Torah to evolve, it's within the system of halacha, within the system of traditional Jewish law. I don't know if now is the time to get into the differences between Orthodox halacha and non-Orthodox halacha. It's a fascinating but complicated process, but there is a very clear system through which halacha is applied in new circumstances. But I don't think there's anyone who would argue, for example, that halacha allows for certain things that are done on Shabbos and so on and so forth.
Right.
That type of evolution is certainly not within the traditional perspective, and that would be considered bringing the Torah to them as opposed to bringing them closer to the Torah.
Understood. So is there a rule, a basic rule that you follow? You personally follow?
I try to follow halacha.
Yeah.
I try to follow Jewish law.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I want to thank you for coming tonight. It's been a real joy. It's been a real, real joy. I want to thank the rabbi for coming to share this evening, to sharing his wisdom and his sensitivity and his kindness with us. Shalom, I want you to be a good boy, and thank you for joining us tonight. Take a cookie for the road, okay? And thank all of you for coming on such a miserable night. Thank you for being with us. Please come back and learn with us again. Have a wonderful week of Shabbos. That was just wonderful. Just wonderful. Thank you so much. No, I know. No, no.